Yeah, I knew girls who were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just shooting, and they were still escorting. Because you always need more. It's never enough. When you've got an infinite, let's say what some people call a God-sized hole in your psyche, in your spirit, it doesn't matter how much money you pour into it.
So Chris, when did you come to LA?
So I first came to LA, I was probably 19, 20 years old, somewhere around then. I'd been going to college in Pennsylvania for computer networking, of all things. And I sort of took a look around and decided I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to be sort of stuck in a cubicle. And I was always drawn to like eccentric and artistic people, and I always had a sense that I wanted to get out, into like the big city and all that kind of stuff. So I moved to LA. I dropped out of college actually and moved to Los Angeles when I was 19, 20, and started attending music school actually there. I was in the music business before I was in the adult entertainment business. So I was in the music business for a few years, and that's sort of how that started.
How'd you get introduced to adult entertainment?
So like I said, I was in the music business and I was just making no money, as most people in the music business do. And, I was really impatient about that. I was always sort of impatient about being successful and making money and whatever at the time. And so I was dating a girl at the time who was not in the adult business, but she said, I have a family friend who has a job opening, because I was looking for a job, and he's looking for an assistant. And she said, but it's in the adult film business. And me, as a 20-year-old kid at the time, or 21 or however old I was, I said, okay, great, I don't care, that's fine. So she introduced me to him, and his company sort of was a broker for adult film rights. So it was kind of on the outside of the business, the ancillary end of the business. And what they would do is act as an agent between adult film producers in the United States and foreign clients who wanted to buy rights for those films. So it was licensing, film licensing. And so I started off as his assistant. And at that time, I think I was making $35,000 a year, which for me at that point was like a good amount of money. I went from work at minimum wage at the time was probably $8 an hour or something, right? So believe it or not, at that time in California, which was almost 20 years ago now, you could make it on that if you had a roommate and whatever. So just to be able to pay my bills for me was exciting, and it was my first real sort of corporate job. I had an office and a desk and all that kind of stuff. And so anyway, I was his assistant, and eventually one of our sales and acquisitions people quit, and I said, hey, give me a shot at that. Let me do that job, and he did. And so I sort of became an agent representing adult film producers and selling their content to foreign, buyers of rights, of adult film rights.
And eventually you became like an agent?
Correct. So yeah, the bulk of my career, so I was doing that for a few years, and then that kind of became a dead end. And I was looking around on a job site one day, which was, there was a site for adult jobs, basically, like within the industry, kind of insular. Like if you're not in the industry, you wouldn't know about it, but it was basically like a Craigslist job section, but for the industry. And I saw on there that there was a talent agency that represented models that was advertising, looking for a new agent. And I thought, I was familiar with this agency. They were the biggest in the industry. If you think of, their mainstream equivalent would be like Wilhelmina or WME or any of those big talent agents. Like they were that of the adult world. And so I thought, yeah, let me apply to that. So I applied, and I don't think they responded. And I kept following up and following up and following up. Anyway, finally I got an interview, and the interview went great. But at the time I was, I think, 25 years old. And I looked young too back then. I probably looked like I was 17. And so they didn't hire me. actually. And so a year goes by, and all of a sudden I get a call. They had hired someone else in the interim. And I get a call from the owner of that company, and he says, hey, are you still looking for a job? Are you still available? The guy that we hired didn't work out. And I said, hell yeah, I am. And again, so I got that job, started working for them, making double or more than double what I was making in my previous job.
Soft White Underbelly is about giving people a space to tell their stories, even when these stories challenge what we think we know. Ground News shows us different perspectives in the media, which is why Ground News is a perfect sponsor for my channel. In a world where algorithms censor much of the information we receive, some of the most important stories get missed from our news feeds. Ground News highlights local news from around the world, giving you an on-the-ground perspective that national coverage might miss. The app and website empowers you to form your own opinions by presenting you with every article published on any news story worldwide. My favorite part of the app is the data it gives you on each news source as you read it, such as where it leans on the political spectrum, a factuality rating indicating how subjective their printed reporting tends to be, and who funds it. I particularly like their blind spot feed, dedicated to showing you news stories that are underrepresented in the mainstream media. You can check this all out by scanning the QR code on screen or clicking the link below. It's easy to forget how much bias can shape the reality we live in. And in a world where our attention is constantly being fought over, my Vantage plan easily helps me keep up with more important stories slipping through the cracks. So I encourage you to check them out at ground.news/SWU. Subscribe through my link or download the mobile app and enter promo code SWU to save 40% off their Vantage plan. And by subscribing or even gifting it to someone you know, you're helping hold the media accountable and helping my channel directly. Thank you for watching.
And it was, from as a 20-some-year-old kid, 25-year-old, it was great. I had my own parking space. We had a beautiful office overlooking the 101 in Los Angeles with big...
In the San Fernando Valley?
Yeah, in the Vivid, what used to be the Vivid building, which I don't know if I don't think it is anymore. But, had these big windows overlooking the highway, and you had my own desk. We had assistants. If I needed my dry cleaning done, someone would do that. So as a 25-year-old kid from a very, very small town, I was like, wow, this is great. This is great. And certainly I didn't have any, moral objection to those things at the time. Because again, I was very young, I think like a lot of young people, I sort of grew up with ideas about porn and sex and whatever that were very of the culture, so.
And tell me about the ins and outs of that job.
So, I mean...
No pun intended.
Yeah. So, really, we operated like any other talent agent. I mean, day-to-day stuff was like, booking shoots for models, negotiating terms of shoots for models. I did quite a lot. I was actually sort of one of the first people to pursue a lot of ancillary revenue streams for models at the time. Social media was a thing, obviously. This would have been like around 2012, 13, 14, somewhere in there. So influencers were just like sort of becoming a thing. And the idea that, a girl could have an Instagram account and make a living just being a pretty girl on Instagram was like just starting to become a reality. And so I kind of saw that and said, there's a finite amount of work you can do as an adult model in terms of shooting. I mean, just physically speaking. And also just career longevity is very short typically for these performers. And so I started negotiating deals with companies for like brand deals and, to have models post on Twitter about a product or a service or whatever, a website.
You represented men and women, right?
We represented men and women. And when I first started, we represented over 100 women and probably a dozen men, maybe more than that. And some of the biggest names in the industry. Like if you watch adult content, you would know who my clients were, 100%. We represented most of it was like us and one other agency that were sort of representing all the big stars in the business, essentially.
Tell me about the the men and women that you'd be representing? What kind of personalities are you dealing with?
So, as far as the women were concerned, most of them were very young. They're coming into the industry 18, 19, 20, 18 to 25 years old generally. Very rare that you get a model coming in after that. And probably for good reason, because that's when their frontal cortex and their brain develops and they make better decisions. But most models who enter that business come from rough backgrounds typically. There are certain stereotypes about the industry that are absolutely true, and the models that participate in it. And one of those things is that almost all models in the industry they come from broken homes most of the time, or it's always something with the father. This is very stereotypical, the stereotypical daddy issues kind of thing. Almost all of them. You will almost never meet an adult film star who had a loving and present father and a great family and whatever. And even a lot of times when they tell you that, it's bullshit. There's something there usually. Or they were subject, so there's always a father issue, and or they were subject to some kind of abuse, whether that's sexual, physical, whatever it is. Almost always. And it's funny, this is bringing to mind, I even the ones that tell you that they weren't, a lot of times it's just because they're not in a place to understand that that's what happened to them. So in sort of prepping for this talking to you, I went back and looked at some of the adult film stars that you've interviewed, which are not a lot, but there was a few. And you interviewed this one girl who's a porn star and an OnlyFans girl. And you asked her that question, was there any abuse in your life? And she said, no, I never had any abuse when I was a kid. My family was great and this and that. And then in the very next sentence, she went on to tell you about how when she was underage, she used to go on webcam sites, Omegle or whatever, not porn sites necessarily, but just webcam chat sites, and speak to older men who would then get her to take her clothes off. And so she's going from telling you that she had no abuse when she was a kid to then describing taking her clothes off for older men online when she was underage. And it's like, well, what do you think that is? And so in her mind, she says, no, I've never experienced any sort of abuse like that, but that's what that is. If you're an underage girl online who is being solicited by older men to take your clothes off, that's abuse. And whether you consciously understand that or not is another thing.
And often they had abuse, so they've blocked out or don't remember,
right,
or whatever.
Reminds me of there's a Carl Jung quote. He says, "Until the unconscious is made conscious, it'll direct your life, and you'll think it's fate." Okay, so there's a lot of those sorts of situations.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that many of these girls are coming from backgrounds that are pretty rough, drug issues in the family issues, father left them. Almost always it's a father issue, almost always. So
I'm sure the adult film industry is notorious for deaths and suicides, drugs, things like that. I'm sure you saw lots of that, right?
And that's the other thing, is that almost all of these girls, and again, people are going to say, well, I was in the industry and I'm totally fine or whatever. Okay, I'm not saying 100%, but I'm saying it's common enough that there's definitely a pattern there. A lot of these girls struggle with anxiety, depression, other mental issues, almost all of them. No matter how much money they make, yeah, like I said, I watched another interview you did with an OnlyFans manager who said, there's this girl making $300,000 a month and she's depressed. She struggles with depression and all this stuff. It's like, yeah, it doesn't go away with the money.
How do these men and women fall into this industry? How do you think they get introduced to it?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. How did they get into it? I think it's
Because I'm sure a lot of your talent was probably you were the first agency they worked with.
yeah. I guess you mean from like a logistical standpoint, how does it happen?
Yeah, is it a sleazy photographer or is it an agent?
Yeah, so it can happen various ways. I mean, we were popular enough in the industry that we didn't really do any scouting.
They would come to you.
They would come to us because as soon as you searched adult
You're the big tuna.
talent agent, yeah, we would come up, news articles about us would come up, they would see our roster, and so they would find us. You know, sometimes we would get referrals from other models or from directors or whatever, but most models that we ended up working with submitted applications through our site, and that's how they found us most of the time. Yeah, and then typically we would, you know, if we were interested in them, we would have a conversation over the phone, and then they would fly out to Los Angeles, and you know, off to the races.
What kind of money were they making, typically?
So, and this is another great topic, the money, because a lot of models would come into that business thinking that it's just going to be an ATM machine. They're going to make a ton of money. It's going to be super easy, like, you know, and of course, public perception sells them that, you know. And even now with OnlyFans, they see, you know, all these girls making this crazy money on OnlyFans. And people don't realize that the average OnlyFans model makes, I think I read is $250 a month is the average OnlyFans account. So, you know, I would even tell these girls sometimes, especially towards the end when my feelings on the industry had sort of changed and my sense of morality had sort of changed around the industry, but I was still in it. And I would even tell these girls sometimes, I would say, you know, there's very few women in this business who make the kind of money that you think you're going to make. You know, and I would say, would you still be doing this if I told you that maybe you're only going to make 70 grand a year? Would you still do it? Because more times than not, that's going to be where you're going to end up, you know, and this is forever. And so is it worth it to make...
The images will live on the internet forever.
Yeah, forever. And is it worth it to make as much money as you could make bartending to do this, you know? And you know, yeah, so can you make a lot of money in the adult industry? Yes, but I'll give you an idea. So when I was in the industry, a starting rate for a boy-girl scene, as we called it, a man and a woman having sex, was $1,000. Okay, that was a starting rate. And that also, not only just a starting rate, but that was a rate that, you know, if you didn't become popular such that it was justifiable to raise your rate, that might stay your rate the entire time you're in the business. I mean, I knew girls who were in the business for 10 years who were still making $1,000 a scene. But just to think, and that didn't change the entire time I was in the business. I mean, didn't matter what inflation was or whatever, that stayed the rate, the starting rate. And so, you know, a very, very popular model will shoot 20 scenes a month. If her body can handle it, and the demand dictates, maybe she can shoot 25. So let's say you're a brand new model and you're super popular and you're making $1,000 a scene. You're shooting 20 scenes a month. That's $20,000. Okay, that's 200 some grand a year. Is that a lot of money in Los Angeles? Especially now. So, you know, is that worth it? I don't know. And that's why a lot of these models end up doing other things besides just shooting adult content. You know, they end up doing prostitution or whatever, or having sugar daddies, you know. And so, yeah, I would warn a lot of these girls, like, you know, maybe you'll make a lot of money, but you have to really think about, and are you okay doing this if you don't? If you just made as much money as you can make at any normal job, would that be okay? This is out there forever, you know? And a lot of them would do it anyway. And, you know, because I just think at that age, at the age that these women are and the backgrounds they come from, they're not prepared to conceptualize what that means. It's incapable. They're incapable of doing it. At 18 years old, to think about that, you know, everybody thinks that they're going to be the star, that, you know, they're going to make all that money, whatever. And, you know.
Or probably even more common than that is they think they're going to do it and no one's really going to see it, especially back then.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, this was, like I said, I was in the industry, I was an agent from about 2013-ish to 2022, somewhere like that. I've been out of the business for 3 or 4 years. It's about 4 years now. So whatever the math is. Yeah, a lot of them thought that they were going to be, all of them did, thought that they were going to be the next star or whatever. I don't know. But and again, there are models who make a lot of money in that industry, but I don't even think it's worth it then, to be honest. But yeah.
But what do you think of OnlyFans now? It's really the same thing, just under a different management.
Yeah, I think it's all bad. If I was dictator tomorrow, I would probably make porn illegal across the board. I don't think it's good for anybody. I don't think it's good for the people that do it. I don't think it's good for the people that participate in it. And I've just seen a lot of very, very sad stories. I know almost nobody that was in that industry that is, that was in it at 20 and by 40 they were retired and happy and had a family and whatever. You see a lot of very sad situations of models who come in when they're very young and they've never had another job before, they have no education, and they're in the industry for 10, 15 years and they try to get out. They find a guy who, likes them, wants to marry them, whatever, and they try to get out. And they find it very difficult because maybe they were making decent money and now they have to go be a waitress at Applebee's. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when that's what you're used to and you have no experience in the real world, it can become a trap, and all that, all those things that you thought were liberating you in your 20s turns out they were actually, you're a slave. And then they come back into the industry at 40 and they've got to shoot scenes for $1,000 a scene, and by then they're older, they're a little bit wiser, they understand. And they don't want to be doing it, but it's the only thing that they could do to make money at that point,
What kind of, I'm sure you have some interesting or sad stories of people have, you've seen the arc of their mental health.
For sure. When I was in the industry, and again, these things change because it's trends, but when I was in the industry, Xanax was a big thing. A lot of the girls were taking Xanax. Because again, a lot of them were depressed, whatever. I saw models who tragically, we represented a model named Cagney, I'm going to say her name, who was a very, very popular model, A-list, I think she won Performer of the Year at AVN one year, like top 10, models in the industry. And, we represented her on and off. Most of the time when I was at that agency, we didn't represent her, but we had represented her. We got her career started, and then she left and went to a different agency. And then she was in and out of the business a bunch of times. And each time she would come back, she'd be with a different agent, or maybe she'd come back to us for a little bit or whatever. But I could always tell that it made her miserable. She didn't like doing it. You could just tell that there was like kind of a broken little girl in there. And I would see her at different events or whatever, and she would just be hammered drunk or, blacked out basically on Xanax or whatever. But again, she came in and out of the industry because she would find a guy who would take her out, and then that guy would break up with her, and then she'd be back in, and then she could go try to do something else, and then that wouldn't work out, and she'd be back in, and she eventually ended up killing herself, and at 20 some years old, I think, late 20s maybe. So, and that is not an uncommon story, So I think OnlyFans, it's like, I guess if there's a scale of things, right? If one thing is less bad than the other, if it's a lesser evil, I suppose you could say that. But I think in a way, I don't know, OnlyFans might be even more detrimental to the consumer in some way than traditional pornography, which I think is already detrimental to the consumer, you know? So I think it's just 6 of one, half dozen of the other, you know? You know, the agencies in our industry, the one that I was part of, others, are licensed by the state just like any other talent agency. Like we have the same, or we had, I'm not in the industry anymore, but we had the same license that like a Wilhelmina would have had, or a WME, or anybody. So we did not engage in escorting stuff ourselves. But, you know, that kind of thing is always around. And yeah, a lot of those girls, I would say most girls, regardless of what agency they were from, were participating in that to some degree or another. Because to them, at that point, you know, once you've compromised, once you've taken that leap into the abyss and you've compromised yourself morally and whatever, and you've decided that you're going to have sex on camera, to the model, at that point, they're not even operating as a person anymore. You know, they've flattened themselves into 2-dimension, you know, where they're almost an object for purchase. And at that point, in her mind, she can either, if you look at it, she can either go and be on set for 6 to 8 hours to make a porn scene and get paid $1,000, or she can go sleep with this guy in his hotel room, and that'll be an hour, and she'll make more money than that, or as much, at least, usually more. And so, yeah, I mean, escorting is definitely a part of that industry. You know, it's not something that I was involved in or that we were involved in directly, although there's always rumors about that. But, you know, I can tell you myself that I was never involved in anything like that. And yeah, it's a part of the industry, and almost all of those girls are doing it. I mean, again, I don't know about now. You know, is a girl that's making $3 million a year in OnlyFans escorting? Maybe, I don't know.
Probably doesn't need to.
You know what? Yeah, but you say that, but like,
there's somebody that'll pay whatever.
I knew so many girls that didn't need to, and they still were. Once you make money your highest moral authority, okay, all of your actions are aligned towards that end, okay, or oriented towards that end, or towards that pursuit. And what, you know, and maybe a lot of these girls are trying to fulfill something in themselves, and that's why they're doing that, or whatever the psychology is. But, you know, yeah, I knew girls who were making hundreds of thousands of dollars a year just shooting, and they were still escorting. Because you always need more. It's never enough. When you've got an infinite, you know, let's say what some people call a God-sized hole in your psyche, in your spirit, it doesn't matter how much money you pour into it. And the sad thing is too, that I knew a lot of girls who made a lot of money escorting, doing OnlyFans, doing porn scenes, and a lot of them end up broke. I knew girls who were cash millionaires who could go to the bank and pull out $1 million in cash if they wanted. Probably had $1 million in cash stuffed under their mattress because they, you know, earned it illicitly. Couldn't put it in the bank. That ended up homeless. I was talking to, you know, I not too long ago, I spoke to someone in the industry, and they were telling me, oh yeah, so-and-so is staying at my house. And the girl that they were talking about was a girl who was a top performer in the business and also was a huge time escort, making a ton of money escorting. Okay, like millionaire, you know. And she's telling, I go, what do you mean she's staying at your house? Why is she staying at your house? And she says, oh, well, she's homeless. And I go, and it blew my mind. I'm like, I knew this girl as someone who was like driving around in a Porsche and, what, you know, had all the stuff that you could want. But the thing about money is it's like, and maybe you've seen this as well because you were in the entertainment business or modeling world or whatever, but like, money is an amplifier. And if you are a person who's spiritually dead or spiritually sick, or, you know, in your psyche you have problems, it will amplify those. It makes them worse. And everything will be taken from you. you know.
I think what happens with these girls, the stories I've seen, is they start out and you're just going to be on camera doing some nudity, and that's how they start, and that's not that terrible. But then the novelty of that for their clients wears off, and then the agents will tell them, well, you need to do a scene with guys. Mm-hmm. So then you're going to do scenes with guys, and then it goes to the next level, and eventually you're doing.
Yeah, and I saw models who came in. I mean, I can think of a model right now who, when she came in the industry, she didn't even want to touch herself on camera. She didn't want to do anything on camera, like, you know, sexually on camera. She wouldn't even, whatever, by herself. And yeah, within the first couple of years, she was doing absolutely everything.
And everything in that industry can be a lot.
Yeah. And so there was plenty of girls who, you know, there's a lot of times where I never wills turned into I wish I hadn't. That happened all the time, you know. And it's not necessarily the agents pressuring them to do it, but the business itself pressures you, because, you know, the more you do, the more work there is, the more potential work there is. And if you come in the industry and you have all these ideas about how much money you're going to make, and you find out that, well, if you're not having sex on camera with guys, that money's not there because that's what people want to pay for. Then if your priority is the money, then yeah, you're going to compromise whatever morals you thought you had, you know, unfortunately. So.
And I think the shame that goes with this work is where it opens up the world of drugs and alcohol and things like that.
Yes, but I wouldn't say, so that's true to a degree, but most people use the word shame as a pejorative. Like, oh, if we just got rid of the shame, it's not the thing that I'm doing. It's your reaction to the thing that I'm doing that makes it bad. And I don't think that's true. I think that some things are just damaging to the soul, you know, like on a spiritual level, or, you know, even just a physical, psychic level. And so when people say, well, like, oh, it's, you know, it's the shame, that's why they do drugs and whatever, and have mental issues and this and that. The participating in the adult business to begin with is as indicative of of a problem that's underlying as the shame that comes along with it is. Like, it's all just a symptom of underlying issues. So, like, you know, the idea to me that the way to solve this issue for everybody is just like, well, we'll just stop shaming them and be totally okay with it, is laughable. You know. Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, yeah, I mean, like, if you are hurting yourself, there should be some shame associated with that. I think we need to bring back a little shame, to be honest. I think we live in a very shameless society, you know, where almost anything goes. We live in a society now that is more permissive of everybody's vices than it's ever been, and everybody's fucking miserable. Because let's talk about freedom for a second. So what we're told, freedom, what we're told is that in society is that is being free to engage in vice, right? So if I'm free, I'm able to you know, screw anybody I want, I'm able to do drugs. That's how you can tell that I'm free. And I'm going to call those actions, for lack of a better term, we're going to call it sin, in the religious context, sin, okay? But even if you're not religious, think of it outside of the religious context. We'll say that sin is those actions which separate you from the highest conception of yourself, okay? So if you conceptualize, you know, who would I be if I was the best version of myself, the most virtuous version of myself, the best version of myself? Sin is that which separates you from that, actions which separate you from that conception, okay? So we have a society that tells us that freedom is the ability to engage in promiscuous sex, drugs, gambling, etc., etc. That's not what freedom is. Because when you do those things, you become a slave to your baser passions, your baser instincts. The instinct to fuck, the instinct to blow money, the instinct to eat, whatever. So society is taking, and what evil is when you take that which is good, you invert it, and then you present the inversion as the good. Okay? So you're free if you have sex, promiscuous sex. You're free if you engage in pornography. You're free if you engage in sports gambling. If you're smoking THC pens all day, okay? They're selling you slavery as freedom, okay? And that's definitionally evil because you're not free when you do those things. You've interviewed a lot of drug addicts. Do they seem very free to you?
No.
Okay. You've interviewed a lot of girls engaged in prostitution and whatever. Do they seem free?
Not at all.
Okay. So freedom, true freedom, is not the freedom to sin, it's the freedom from sin. And again, I'm using that word because I don't have a better term, but you can think of it in a religious context or not, it doesn't matter. The same principle applies. A lot of people get hung up on like, oh, I'm not religious, so I can't say that.
Yeah.
But that's what freedom is. Freedom is freedom from sin, not to sin. And we have a society that's telling young people, what are we, everybody complains about, society, and it's so hard to date, and no one wants to know you, and it's hard to have friends, and I can't find anybody, and all this, and everything just seems like it's a mess. And look at what we're telling young people. Every other commercial on TV is sports gambling and pharmaceuticals. We're telling young people, yeah, watch as much pornography as you want. It's good for you. In fact, it prevents rape. It prevents all that. It's like a vitamin practically. And the industry comes out with all these studies, every few years or whatever, goes, oh, we've studied it. And actually people who watch porn are like way happier and whatever. No, they're fucking not. No, they're not. And especially as a man, like, when you're a slave to that baser instinct, I think part of becoming a man is understanding the sexual instinct and subduing that or directing that energy in a higher order way, right? So like, obviously if you're expressing that by sitting at home and jerking off in front of a screen, like you're one step above an animal. Like you're like monkeys do that. Okay, you're not participating in anything beautiful or freeing. You're not being liberated, and society is selling you slavery as liberation.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Did you see your psyche or whatever changing as you worked in the industry?
For sure. And when I got into the business, I was very young. And so I believed all this stuff. I believed there's nothing wrong with porn. Like if a girl wants to be promiscuous, like that's a part of her expressing her, femininity and independence and all this stuff, which it's not. And I bought into all that stuff. I was also I was like pro-abortion. I was all that stuff. Which that's another topic, because there's girls in that industry that use abortions as birth control, And, but again, I was like a boy, and I didn't understand like what it meant to be a man and what that meant in society and what it means in relation to the women that I interact with. And so by the time I got into my like late 20s, I had moved to Vegas. We opened up an office in Las Vegas. So I moved out of LA and moved to Vegas. And my girlfriend at the time got pregnant. And we found out we were having a daughter. And as that event tends to do, if you're a relatively conscious person, you start asking yourself questions like, what does it mean to be a man? What do I believe in? All the big questions of the universe. What do I believe about God? What do I believe about sex? What do I believe about whatever? Because a lot, when you're an adolescent or a young man, you're just running on whatever your programming is from society and your childhood and whatever. And, you're not giving too much forethought to like, oh, should I hook up with this girl? Or, what are the spiritual implications of, And maybe to some degree, that's not the responsibility of like very young men. Maybe that's the responsibility of men when they get older. Maybe, I don't know. But I started thinking about all these things and asking myself these questions and figuring out, okay, it's time for me to really figure out, what do I believe about these things, if anything? And when I first got in the business, my thought about these young girls doing this was what everybody else was saying, which was like, well, they're 18, they're adults, they can do whatever they want. And for me to suggest otherwise would be oppressive. I'd be oppressing them, somehow, if I, encourage them to not just be an object. That would be oppression, I guess. And so I started, that started changing for me. The attitude that, well, they're 18 and they can do whatever they want, and who am I to judge? And I came to realize that actually, if you're a man, especially, in relation to women that are younger than you and who don't know about the world yet, we have some responsibility to them. I think that one of the things that makes a man is that he is responsible for those that are meek around him, And so I started having a real problem sitting down with 18, 19-year-old girls and being an accessory to what I knew could become the darkest part of their life. And maybe it wouldn't be, but my whole thing was like, I never want to be an accessory to someone's downfall. And so I started looking at it, when you get up towards 30, you look at an 18-year-old girl, and now I'm 38, but you look at an 18-year-old girl and they don't look the same as when you were 23, and you don't see them the same because all that stuff that they don't know now. And it's so, as a man, I think it's incumbent upon you to do something about that. It's not anymore just, well, they're an adult, they can do what they want. Yeah, I guess technically by the letter of the law, but is that right? I don't think so. I think you're failing in your duty as a man if you think that way.
You definitely feel like the industry as a whole is just bad for society.
I do. Yeah, like I said, I don't think it's good for the girls that are doing it, and the guys too. A lot of people don't talk about the guys; they just talk about the girls. But there's a lot of guys that have a lot of struggles as well, and a lot of sad situations that I saw. Because guys can actually, if they're good performers, they can actually have much longer careers than the girls. So a male can perform into his 50s if he stays in shape and, whatever. But, if you're a conscious man, you come to some point where if you're stepping on an adult film set and you're 50 years old and you've got some 18-year-old girl on set with you who doesn't want to, who would never off camera be having a relationship with you. And I'm not saying that never happens, but it's rare, okay? And, she smells like weed. She's on, she's probably on Xanax or something or whatever. And you, at that point, have to have sex with this girl and she's going to get paid $1,000. If at 50 years old, that doesn't do something to you internally, then you're probably just lost. You've given yourself up and there's no soul left in you. You're done. And so a lot of these guys get very depressed too. And because at a certain point, when you're a male, again, if you're relatively conscious and you think about these things, you realize that you don't want to be running around chasing skirts for the rest of your life either. You know, you want to settle down with one woman who you love and maybe have kids, or maybe not, but whatever. And that becomes very difficult, because what woman who's worth dating is going to be okay with you going and banging some 19-year-old or 20-year-old, whatever, as a grown man, and then coming home to her? It doesn't happen. And a lot of these guys become very depressed because, again, they're trapped. And some of them try to move on to directing or whatever, other portions of the business, but that's not always possible. And it ends up being a very sad situation. And there's guys, again, there's men that kill themselves in that business, you know, regularly, and you don't hear about them as much because they're males. So, and a lot of people don't even know them by name. But that happens, you know. You're the thing that you thought was fun at 20, well, it's not so fun anymore. And but you can't know that when you're 20. You know what I mean? Like that, going back to what I was saying before, like an 18-year-old girl physically cannot conceptualize what this means for her life. And you as a grown man know what it means, and you're ushering her into it, you know? And so, yeah, it becomes very hard for these people to get in relationships. The girls too, very hard. Even as an agent, it was very hard for me to date women outside the industry, because as soon as I told them what I did, they wanted nothing to do with me, even though I wasn't a performer, even though they didn't know me, you know, whatever. And especially if you're on camera, having sex with a lot of people, you know, over many years, you know. There's a quote that I heard one time, I forget who it was, but he says, promiscuity hurts people that you love that you haven't met yet. And I think that's pretty good. I think it's true, you know.
And what are you doing now? You've been out for a few years at least.
So I'm in the real estate business now. So at you know, around that time that I had my first daughter, I kind of, again, I could no longer wholeheartedly do what I was doing. You know, my morals had changed around it, and I knew that it was a sinking ship, you know, and that I had to get out. And so eventually I was able to do that. I started doing real estate on the side and did quite well, and which allowed me to leave that industry and to, you know, go off on my own. I moved back to the East Coast, where I was originally from, and yeah, so that was 4 years ago now.
And OnlyFans was kind of starting to change the porn industry anyway. I think that agency was probably affected by OnlyFans. Yeah, well, that was the thing too, is that, like I said, it was kind of the agency business was kind of a sinking ship, because, you know, just like in other forms of media, the adult industry has seen a very serious contraction and consolidation, I guess is the word, where, you know, these big players buy everything else up. It's just like in the movie business. There's like 4 major studios that make movies. Okay, in the record business, there's like 4 major record labels that put out records. It's the same exact thing in the adult industry. And all of that was sort of spurred on by the internet and free porn and whatever. And so yeah, OnlyFans sort of changed the game. Once every 10 years in the adult industry, some technology changes the whole game. So like when DVDs came in, that the VHSs were done. And then when the tube sites came in, that gave you unlimited free pornography without having to pay for it. That ended the DVD industry, and a lot of producers went out of business because they never adapted. And then the rest were all sort of bought up and consolidated. And yeah, and the free porn thing is another thing. Like what are we doing to kids? That I just want to touch on that for a second. Like, you know, to get on some of these tube sites where there is unlimited hardcore adult content in full HD format, there's no age verification whatsoever. And certain lawmakers or activists or whatever have tried to get these companies to be responsible about that and institute age verification, all this, and they have fought tooth and nail. The industry has fought tooth and nail because they know, I believe, they know that a good size
chunk of their audience that are accessing this stuff are underage kids, essentially, under 18.
Probably extremely underage too.
Oh yeah, I think I read somewhere the average exposure to pornography now for a young person is 8 years old. 8 years old.
The average first?
Yes. And that changes your brain in a way that you can't understand, that people do not understand. And it's setting that kid up for a lifetime addiction. It is an addiction. And again, the industry puts out stuff every year about, oh, porn's not addictive, and we've done a study, and it's 100% addictive.
Relationships and dating will never be the same.
No. And again, you are teaching very young kids to, so in a person, there's a person's attributes, and then there's a person, and the attributes are replicable. Okay, so like, let's say, just for example, hypothetically, I like blondes. Well, there are thousands of women who are blondes, right? So attributes are replicable. The person is not. The person is unique, okay? And you are training very young male minds to look at women as a set of attributes and to not look at them as people. And then so young women now, when he's online at 14 years old, he's searching blondes, big butts, boobs, whatever. That's his conceptualization of how to categorize women in his brain. And when he looks at them, those are the things that he's attracted to first. And so then you hear young women that'll say, I don't know what's with these guys. I go out, like they have no tact. They're not gentlemen. They're whatever. And they're creepy. They're weird. They're sending me like pictures of their wieners, and like, yeah, you've trained an entire generation of young men to look at women to flatten them into two-dimensional objects and to not be primarily concerned with the person.
This is what we built.
Yeah, and we're all suffering for it. And there's no sense also in arguing between the sexes as to whose fault it is. If you talk to young women about dating, they'll blame young men for being whatever. If you talk to young men, they'll blame young women for whatever. And the truth of it is that, that it's both sides, and both sides are suffering. And as a product of what society has sort of shoved them into. And so both sides have to figure it out. And you're going to have to give each other some grace in doing that. And women, I think, need to be more vocal about this as well. Because women, I think a lot of times women don't want to be confrontational. They kind of want to go along. If it's socially acceptable to say, yeah, porn's great, it's no problem, whatever, then women tend to want to say that and be agreeable and whatever, and agree with like, oh, well, it's sexually liberating for the woman and she's in control and this and that. She's not. She's so out of control you wouldn't fucking believe it. And I think young women have to speak up and say, actually, no. Like, if you're a guy who watches porn, like, that's not cool. Like, that's not fine. Do you
think there's any closing this box of Cobras?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think there's an attempt to, and like, I think just now in the younger generation, like Gen X, or not Gen X, Gen Z is starting to wake up to some of this stuff. Gen Z is like a very polarized generation. Like, on one side, you've got like the next evolutionary step to like the millennials as far as like social permissiveness and sexual freedom and all this kind of stuff. And then you've got this other sort of reactionary pole that is like extremely conservative. Like, if you look at polling of Gen Z, like some of them are the most politically conservative, socially conservative in generations. And so I think there's an awareness among some young men. And this is why people like, the rise of people like Jordan Peterson and all these sorts of guys, like, these guys aren't saying anything revolutionary. They're saying stuff to young men that our grandfathers knew. about being a man, about responsibility, about sacrifice, about all these sorts of masculine virtues. And I think that a lot of young men are trying, they recognize that like they don't want to be just mired in slop, that like they are more than just like, just their baser instincts. I think there's even if it's not necessarily a conscious feeling of that, there's a subconscious feeling about that. And so I think there are young men and women who are, I think we're starting to turn maybe a page on that, but who knows? Who knows which way that's going to go.
Yeah. All right, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on this crazy industry that we've created.
Yeah.
And we'll see where it goes.
Guess we will. We're all along for the ride, aren't we?
Mm. All right, thank you very much.
Cool.
When I was designing the first Soft-White Underbelly book, I realized that there were so many great portraits that weren't going to make it into that book. They just wouldn't fit. And once I saw how well that first book sold, I knew I'd have to design a second book. This second book is finally ready to ship. Like the first one, this book has a collection of some of the best portraits from Soft-White Underbelly, accompanied by a quote from that person's interview. This book features another group of Rebecca portraits, as well as a collection of color images of the Whitaker family, and plenty of others. You can order yours for $125 or $150 for a signed copy at softwhiteunderbelly.org. Again, like the first book, once this book is sold out, I will not be printing more of them. The portraits are what Soft-White Underbelly is all about, and these two books contain the best of all that work. Thank you for watching.